I'm Camila Escalante. I am the co-founder and editor of Calsach News, and I'm in Caracas, Venezuela. Today I interviewed Canadian author Arnold August, who is here in Venezuela participating in the World Festival, the Anti-Fascist International, which took place between January 9th and 11th. That event coincided with the inauguration of President Nicolás Maduro, who this week took office for his third term. Arnold was also here in Venezuela to accompany the elections in July of 2024. I spoke to Arnold about what he's witnessed here in Venezuela, and in particular within the context of Venezuela-Canada relations. We wanted to be there and document the inauguration of President Nicolás Maduro, not only for its historic significance for Venezuela and the continuation of the Bolivarian Revolution, but also because of the threats that were being made by the far-right opposition and their allies, particularly in the United States, to try to intervene in and sabotage the process.
So here we are in Caracas, Venezuela, January 12th, 2025, in the Plaza Simón Bolívar. I'm here with Camila Escalante, a well-known journalist from Canada, but also well-known in many parts of Latin America and even in Europe. Now, we both attended two important events that took place in Caracas here on January 9th, on January 10th. Now, what happened there? We know that the United States and its allies attempted to provide a pretext in order to intervene in Venezuela and stop the swearing-in ceremony of President Nicolás Maduro. However, this was defeated. Why? In my view, two reasons. One is Venezuela has that tradition going all the way back to Simón Bolívar, of protagonistic democracy and to defend the socialist Bolivarian Revolution. Before we go into what happened on those two important days and what happened after with the sanctions, allow me to share with you some of my thinking that has evolved over the last, say, 10, 11, 12 years on the issue of protagonist democracy and Bolivarian socialism. My 2013 book, in the section dealing with Venezuela, I deal with what I call at that time the proactive nature of Venezuela's democracy. For example, how at the grassroots level, under the leadership of the Venezuelan Revolution, they organized communal councils as well as taking other steps. For example, providing funds where the communal councils and other organisms at the grassroots level can decide and make those decisions and investigate where they want it to be done. In the 2013 book on the section of Venezuela, in addition to the commune, I also dealt with in detail with all the missions that were carried out by the revolutionary government, such as health, education, etc., sports. A few years after this book was published, on one of my visits to Caracas in 2017, I believe, I was invited by Kelly Soar to give my impressions of my visit to Caracas, and specifically the very important January 23rd burial, popular burial. And what I said was what I got an impression in visiting there and speaking with the people there is that people see the revolution, Bolivarian Revolution, as their revolution. And thus they are the actual sponsors of it, the authors of their own revolution, which makes for a very important move towards what I would call protagonist democracy. It was a short while later, I wrote an article for Black Agenda Report in 2019. And what was the title? Venezuela, is this a new experience in protagonist democracy? I asked the question. I dealt with it. And my answer was yes, in the affirmative. In fact, in that article in Black Agenda Report, I say that in my opinion, in any case, that Venezuela has crossed the Rubicon from participative democracy, which is quite passive, towards protagonist democracy, a major advance for the people of Venezuela. And so, as you can see, I'm very intrigued with this whole notion of protagonist democracy. Thus, I investigated how is it possible that this is applied to Venezuela. For example, the civic military union in Venezuela, which in my view is the basis for the defense of Venezuela, as we saw here in Caracas over the last few days. And in that article in Granma, I went into detail, like what is the difference between, on the one hand, the Venezuelan military, which fosters the type of people such as Chavez and, as we see it now, the armed forces of Venezuela defending Venezuela, that on the one hand. And on the other hand, the opposite is the tradition of the armed forces in Chile, which does not at all open the door for this type of participation. Now, in that article at Granma on the civic military union in Venezuela, I was curious to go into one of the points that was raised, and that is the role of the militias. That is people who are citizens, they're either retired or still working, but volunteered to be part of the militia. And this, along with the armed forces, is the basic of the civic military union. In fact, in a visit not too long after that, I interviewed members of the militia. So in those interviews, I think we can see the real grassroots nature of the civic military union, with the militias as an integral part of it. The militias being people who are either retired, not retired, but still, even while working, volunteer to be part of the militia, which is a key ingredient to the civic military union and led to the defeat a few days ago when the U.S. and its allies tried to overturn the decision of Venezuelans to have Maduro as their president. Now, not too long after the elections, when we were here together in July 28th, 2024, right? Right after that, I think it was in August, the revolutionary government headed by President Maduro organized a popular consultation with regards to how the budget of the state should be spent in the local areas, which areas where people want to invest their time and energy. And this is another example how the protagonist democracy, even though has gone a long way, the Venezuelan people and its government are not ashamed to say we have to have improvement, and that's what they're doing. There's no end in sight when they take the measures to have the people completely involved in their revolution. So we were here together on January 9th, 2025, a few days ago, when everyone heard about the demonstration that took place in Caracas.
The opposition had said that they would be installing their own president. Thus, the country was put under security protocol. Arnold explains a failed false flag event carried out by opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who faked her own abduction.
Of course, there's a lot of false information. People have to be very careful. What happened on that famous January 9th? The opposition only had a few hundred people showing up for their star, Maria Machado, despite all the international media, U.S. State Department, the entire Western world were ganging up to promote her. But all she could get was a few hundred people. And of course, then it was said that she was kidnapped. This is false. Let's go through it. Why? 3 reasons. Firstly, they themselves say there were thousands of people there when Machado was speaking. I think there was only a few hundred, but let's say there was 1,000. That means 1,000 cell phones, right? How come in those 1,000 cell phones, there's not one footage, no footage at all of her being supposedly kidnapped? Secondly, not only was there no repression, as they tried to imply by the armed forces, what actually happened, this information I got from people who are aware of the situation, the police and the national security force, they actually helped, assisted those Machado opposition forces who were walking on a big highway, and so it should not be dangerous for them. They actually assisted them in their march. Thirdly, what is very important as well was that, just the logic, let's think of this. Why would the Maduro government, why would they want to arrest her, knowing that this would create an international scene and a pretext to interfere in the internal affairs of Venezuela? So the bottom line, don't believe what the media tells you about what happened on January 9th. The next day, on January 10th, very important day, historical day in my opinion, when Nicolás Maduro was sworn in as president for the new 5-year mandate. He was sworn in the National Assembly with dignitaries from different countries. That was sort of private. What happened in the afternoon, we participated in it, right? Very important, very interesting. You had actual public swearing in taking place, where people, I have videos of that, people saying, I agree that Nicolás Maduro won the election and he is the constitutional president of Venezuela. A very clear example. There's tens of thousands of people there swearing in on their own president, Nicolás Maduro, on January 10th. It's an amazing experience.
Venezuela is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world, with over 1,000 unilateral coercive measures leveled against the country, according to the Venezuelan Anti-Blockade Observatory. While the sanctions are U.S.-led, about 60% of sanctions are imposed by U.S. allies, including the European Union, Canada, and individual European governments. As of 2023, Canada had imposed 108 unilateral coercive measures. The Trudeau administration decided to impose additional sanctions as punishment for holding elections and for President Maduro's new term.
An important public meeting took place. And in that public meeting, Nicolás Maduro announced, I only found out from him, I didn't know about it. He announced that Canada has started sanctions against Venezuela, as did the United Kingdom, European Union, and the United States. What did he do? All the people who were sanctioned, they were there in the public space. I saw them, you saw them. And he went onto the stage, and Nicolás Maduro, in a very emotional gesture, decorated all of those people with their military, civilian, or U.S. justice of the case, gave them the highest decoration available in Venezuela as a response to the unjust sanction by the West against Venezuela. And then, I know for me it was very emotional. I really loved that. So after the formal part, these people who were sanctioned, they were in the audience, along with myself and other people. So what did I do? I went over there and I shook their hands. And I told them, of course I speak Spanish, I am from Canada, but I stand with you, all of you, sanctions people, the Venezuelan Revolution, Nicolás Maduro, against the government of Canada and against the entire West, who are trying to overthrow all your great accomplishment going on for many, many decades.
Arnold recalled the leading role Canada played in meddling in Venezuela and trying to overthrow the elected government through the so-called Lima Group.
Trump, at the time, his first mandate, they were not members of that Lima Group. Justin Trudeau was the hand-picked instrument of the United States in the Lima Group to lead that Lima Group towards what they thought would be the overthrow of the Maduro government. But Justin Trudeau, they stopped sanctions on Venezuela. What reason do they give? Well, they say, problem of human rights in Venezuela. Wait a second. Trudeau, why don't you look at the problem of human rights in Canada? Your own commission, which was responsible for looking into the issue of the indigenous peoples in Canada, came to the conclusion that Canada is committing genocide against the indigenous people. An important voice in the residential school, which many thousand people were killed, indigenous people died in the residential school. An important voice against it, Ellen Gabriel points this out. So does Sean Carleton, a professor at the University of Manitoba, expert in the so-called residential school. Their studies confirmed all of that. Now, in addition to Mr. Trudeau's concern about human rights, of all people in the world, today, in January 2025, Justin Trudeau thinks Venezuela should have free and fair election. That's a laugh. Justin Trudeau, you just resigned because everyone hates you in Canada. You had no choice, even your own party. And instead of having the elections, free and fair election, you decided to stay on as Prime Minister for another 3 months until the end of March, without the Parliament, and still acting as Prime Minister without any mandate, or even until they choose a new leader of the Liberal Party who will become the new Prime Minister without any input of the Canadian citizens, aside from the very small elite of the Liberal Party. Is this free and fair elections in Canada? Trudeau, get your nose out of Venezuela, concentrate on Canada. Now, if one bases oneself on the corporate media internationally, one would get the impression that no one supports Maduro. Everyone's against Maduro. That Venezuela and President Maduro are isolated in the international scale. They are not isolated internationally, as they are not isolated within their own country. For example, the important swearing-in ceremony that people from important countries such as China sending messages, as well as Nicaragua, Ortega was there in person, Cuba, of course, and many countries around a wide spectrum of political thinking critical thought, even if it does not coincide with the Bolivarian Revolution. But countries and people's social movement spoke very clearly on January 10th when they say that we recognize the election of President Maduro. Far from being isolated, who was really isolated was the United States and their allies. That is why they're trying so hard to create the impression that Maduro is isolated. He is far from being isolated. People celebrated in the streets a couple of days ago because they know they defeated an important attempt by the United States to interfere in the internal affairs of Venezuela, and Venezuela has the support of important countries and blocs across the world. Here we are in front of that great statue that represents so much for the people of Latin America, and I would say the people of the world who look to Venezuela as a country, as a model, and defend its sovereignty, its independence against the U.S. and Western world. This is what the people want. They're happy here. West should just forget about Venezuela, deal with your own problems.